Doctor Who has a long history of using horror themes in its stories, from the folk horror setting of the demons to the allusions to Frankenstein in Brain of Morbius or Villa Diodata, and vampires in both E-Space and Venice. Our myths and legends have always been at the centre of this strange show about time and space, but something has always run true. For every supernatural encounter, there's always been an alien explanation. With Russell T Davies leaning heavily into myths, legends, old gods and fantasy elements, that could all change with 73 yards. In this video, you'll see my initial reaction to the episode, and we'll have a quick chat about the reactions to Boom and the series so far. As you can imagine, this video contains spoilers, but if you're not too scared to take the journey with me, then why not dim the lights, hold your loved ones close, and pull the covers up over your head as we go beyond the sofa. It's been a week since Boom, and it's been largely lauded as the best show of the current run. Certainly it's got people talking again, although there's one thing that we should consider when taking a look back at this. It's all on the theme of religion. Now, I'm what you might call an apathetic agnostic. I don't know, and I don't care. But you're always going to find people, especially in the UK, who have a real connection to Christianity. For many of us, even if we're not religious now, it's what we were taught in schools. It forms the bedrock of a lot of what we might consider British culture. In fact, as we go on to talk about folk horror today, well, much of that horror comes from a subversion of Christian values. So I was surprised, although I probably shouldn't have been shocked, when I found out that there were people who didn't like the episode because of the message about Christianity. Now, I would consider that that message was really about, blind faith, about authoritarianism, about, authoritarian religious structures. In fact, it's the same message that we've seen across the whole of the history of Doctor Who. No, this isn't anything which is particularly different. The only problem here was the way in which the message was delivered. Many people felt that the delivery of that message was completely mishandled, and it made it feel like it was the religion that we were being told was wrong, that belief itself was wrong.
Most armies would notice that they were fighting smoke and shadows, but not this lot, Ruby. You know why? Because they have faith.
Shut up!
Faith! The magic word that keeps you never having to think for yourself.
Sure, there's a section at the end where the Doctor admits to Splice that their spirituality is not a bad thing, but too much of the show seemed to be at odds with that message. Furthermore, when somebody pointed this out on Twitter, they were piled on and at least for a short period of time felt that they had to remove themselves from the platform. This is not the sort of fandom that we should have. And I'm somebody who believes that if there is an issue, it really should be the people who are most affected by that issue who get listened to the most. In this instance, it happens to be the people who are Christian, and I wonder why so many people felt the need to voice a contrary opinion when somebody has basically stood up and said, hey, look, this is hurting me. But Boom seems to have been pretty well regarded overall, and a lot of people were saying that it was a return to form for the series. This, of course, prompted a lot of talk about viewing figures again, and I have to reiterate the caveats that I had last week. We don't know what the metrics are for tracking the success of Doctor Who in the UK. What I would say, and I'm pretty sure that a lot of commentators who are fairly positive about Doctor Who won't say this, the viewing figures are not good. We had the consolidated in, and we know that Doctor Who, even at the current time, can command figures of around about 7 million. As it is, both episodes combined are hovering around the 4 million mark. But what's actually disappointing is the audience share. Typically, Doctor Who has been able to manage a pretty high audience share, usually over 30% and often in the high 30s and early 40s. Space Babies came in at 26%, The Devil's Cord at 23%. This isn't a disaster, but when you see what it was up against and the fact that Eurovision was on afterwards, I would have expected something much better. What's very interesting, though, is the top 10 on Disney Plus. Doctor Who managed to get into the top 10 of every territory in the world on Disney Plus. And that's the sort of thing that could very well mean the show will keep its funding. If it can still bring people through the door, I'd still be wary of anybody saying that the show is 100% safe. Like I said, we don't really know what the metrics are going to be needed to keep it on the air. But we should be aware that it's also one of those soft power series, something that's popular enough in other territories that producing it brings the BBC a lot of clout on the global market. So the viewing figures aren't great in the UK, but that doesn't automatically spell the end for the series either. One last thing, there was a big drop-off between the opener and Boom to just over 2 million last Saturday night. Again, not good. Again, we don't know what this will ultimately mean for the show, so it's worth keeping an eye on, but not getting too worried about too soon. With all of that out of the way, let's talk about 73 Yards. And I said there's going to be spoilers. Well, it's going to happen straight away, because what we got here wasn't actually the folk horror that we were promised. Yes, there was a bit of bait and switch. I don't actually think that was necessarily a bad thing. It did keep us on our toes a little bit when we were speculating about the episode, and in some respect, I'm a little bit disappointed about that. I love folk horror, and I love it when Doctor Who does folk horror, because there's something very British about the way that it mixes folk horror and cosmic horror in order to make something different. And of course, we're going to talk about the ending eventually and what that means, but I do think that they may have missed a little bit of a trick here, because whilst they lent into the ideas of folk horror, the story could have pushed that a little bit more. So let's set the scene. The episode opens with the Doctor and Ruby in Wales, and as they step outside the TARDIS, the Doctor steps on a fairy circle, breaking it. And whilst they're both looking at the circle, wondering what it is, the Doctor disappears, and Ruby is left all alone. Now, we knew this wasn't going to be a Doctor-heavy episode, but I'm not sure we realised quite how light an episode it would be until we actually saw it. Ncuti is hardly in this at all. It's only barely a Doctor Who episode in that respect. But it does mean that Millie is given a good chance to shine, and shine she does. One of the reasons that I think this TARDIS team is actually very strong is because not only do you have a great Doctor, but you also have an incredibly strong actor in the role of companion. We've seen that over the years as well. In fact, I think we've been really lucky with companions, but we often don't talk about how good they are as actors in other respects. Millie's performance in this goes from fear to pain to love to regret, and it really emphasises how good an actor she actually is. So after she sees the Doctor disappear and sees an old woman in the distance which she can never get close to, Ruby makes her way towards a village in the distance. Along the way, she meets a hiker played by the famous Susan Twist. I'm not sure what to make of the whole Susan Twist thing. It wouldn't surprise me if this was another sort of bait and switch by Russell in order to get people talking. And if that's true, then people have been talking. There's been theories from her being the Doctor's granddaughter all the way through to her being one of the other gods that's been released. And I know it's kind of fun to speculate, but I'm kind of ready to just sit and wait and see what happens with it and not be too disappointed when it turns out that she was just some old woman all along. If she isn't, however, something has gone very wrong indeed, because this being goes to walk towards the old woman who has to keep 73 yards away and ends up running away in fear. And this is where we actually start to get that folk horror element come into the story. Ruby goes into a pub, and in the pub she's given the legend of Mad Jack.
And then there's the blood. What blood?
Of course, at the time you don't know that this is all being made up by the patrons just to make a fool out of Ruby. Quite cleverly, however, it did mean that there is a good chunk of the show that they could just tease you with all of the folk horror elements included. But for the most part, they go away, those elements go away at the end of that section when Ruby is forced to leave the village and moves back to London. What we get then, however, is a fairly bog-standard ghost story. It's a lot more M.R. James than Adam Neville, however, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. M.R. James incorporated a lot of folk horror elements into his stories, even though they were usually set within the confines of the modern day. And that's what you get here. Ruby is essentially cursed to wander the earth with this woman following her at 73 yards. And any time that somebody goes to talk to the woman, they're scared so much that they want nothing more to do with Ruby. She loses her mother. She can't hold a steady boyfriend. Kate Stewart and Unit are affected by this woman as well. Essentially, all avenues of help are cut off to Ruby, and she has no idea why this is happening. All of this is backed up by an incredibly well-directed and well-thought-out production. What I really loved about this with the scenes in the pub, which used every single trick of classic horror to make the situation more unnerving, from Dutch angles to wide-angle lenses which distort the face. This was filmed like every classic horror film, and it really worked. Now, there are times when Doctor Who has been pretty scary, but this is still a family show at heart. You couldn't go full-on horror in a Doctor Who story, but I think that the production took it as far as it could before you start to get complaints from parents. Because it was scary in as much as, it was unsettling and it was unnerving. It wasn't the monster under the bed or in the closet. Or it wasn't the monster hidden in plain sight and terrorizing the village. It was a lot more psychological. And there again, we get into a situation which is a lot more like an M.R. James story than a traditional Doctor Who tale. When Ruby gets back to London, we see the direction shift. What started out as a very traditional horror story, with a lot of the horror tropes included, becomes a more modern version of the same thing. We still get those moments where camera tricks and framing and the mise-en-scène give you the feel of a modern horror movie, but it also serves to cement the story in the real world. Millie, at this point, is going from playing herself at 18 to herself at 40. And I've got to admit that was one bit that didn't quite work for me. Being in my 40s myself, I've got a lot of friends who are around the same age, and Millie just didn't look quite right. She still looked a bit too young. I mean, having said that, I can forgive the production for not being able to make an 18-year-old girl look like a 40-year-old woman. They didn't do the worst job in the world, if I'm being fair. We then get the subplot of Roger ap Gwilym, a Welsh politician who the Doctor says is one of the worst Welsh people in history. Recognising that name, Ruby decides that she's going to do something about it and sets out to stop him. And this is the point on Ruby's journey where she finds acceptance in the position that she's in. Instead of the old woman who is following her and being a burden, she is now a solution that Ruby can use to solve the problem she faces, namely the politician. This is a smart move because at some point, Ruby has to take back some sort of agency, and it's here that we get to see her do it. It's here that we get to see her save the world without the Doctor. But it's not over. The threat has gone, but for the rest of her life, the old woman follows her until the final day where she's about to die, and we finally realise that the old woman was Ruby all along. Again, this is a fairly typical M.R. James style ending, and I know I keep mentioning that a lot, but I do think that it's a really good framing to look at this episode through. His work was seminal amongst horror writers, and it's got such a big impact even to this day. And this is exactly the sort of plot that his readers would have delighted in. With Ruby's job done, she's transported back to the moment that the TARDIS arrives with her younger self on board. She's only there a moment, but it's enough for Ruby to be taken out of the moment of stepping out of the TARDIS, and noticing her sets Ruby and the Doctor on a different path, a path that means the fairy circle is no longer broken and everything that we've experienced no longer happens. Except it probably has happened in some way, shape or form. None of this is really explained, and that's something that Doctor Who usually does very well. I can't see this sort of storytelling going down well with somebody if they've tuned into Doctor Who to find those explanations. One thing that Doctor Who does as a series is sort of pull back the curtain on things like this, things that are mysterious, much like Sherlock Holmes. A good Doctor Who story has that mystery at its heart, which is solved by the end of the episode, and we don't quite get it here. Those ghost stories don't quite do the same sort of thing. But what we do get is a really well-produced story that strips everything away from our companion and puts her in a situation where she just has to survive. It's not surviving the monster of the week, it's surviving life without the very things that every one of us need in order to have that life. Friends, family, relationships, all stripped away until the very thing that is doing this to her becomes the thing with which she finds comfort. So we're never going to find out what the old woman is saying to people in order to frighten them away from Ruby. In all honesty, we shouldn't find that sort of thing out, because part of the terror of the story is knowing that there is something that that woman can be saying that causes those reactions, but not knowing what it is. We're also never going to find out exactly what's happening or has happened. Unlike all of the Doctor Who stories that have come before us, this one mystery will always remain unsolved. Unless, of course, there are going to be other episodes later on that do this in the future. I'm not sure how this episode is going to play out with children. I'm not sure whether the slower pace of this is something that they'll put up with, or whether they'll end up getting scared by some of the content. It'll be interesting to find out. And I'm sure that we'll hear from parents in the fullness of time. What this has highlighted for me, however, is that all of the episodes that we've seen in this series so far seem just that little bit too short. There's something about the current format that's just not working for me anymore, and I think it's just the length of the episodes. If any story needed room to breathe, it was this one. I'm sure Devil's Cord and even Space Babies could have done with a little bit of extra breathing room. In fact, Space Babies went at such a fast pace that I'm sure it would have been a little bit of a relief for audience members who were trying to keep up. Interestingly, many of the Big Finish box set stories end up being around about an hour long, and those don't always feel crammed. Maybe in the future the production needs to consider having hour-long episodes instead of the 45-minute ones. Even 2 30-minute episodes might work, but 45 minutes, it just seems that little bit too short. Despite that, 73 Yards did work for me, not as a folk horror, because there was so much of this that was just taken away from the folk horror elements that I was hoping for. But as a general horror story, it's in the Doctor Who universe, it worked incredibly well. That's what I think anyway. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and thank you ever so much for watching until the end. I can't wait until next week. Dot and Bubble is what we will be experiencing, and it looks like giant arthropods are terrorizing a city. Who doesn't like that sort of thing? Anyway, I'll see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Do leave a comment below and let me know what you think of the episode. I'd love to hear your thoughts. But that's it until next time, when we go beyond the sofa.